In its infancy in the 1980s, gaming saw one of its most adventurous periods of experimentation. Born in gaming's simplest times were genres, mechanics, and tropes that have lasted nearly half a century. Among these was the idea of horror experiences pitting players against an unstoppable force that followed them level to level. This enemy archetype would come to be known as the Stalker, a staple in horror games even today, 45 years later. But what is the true history of the Stalker? Which games created it, refined it, and ultimately perfected it? And how did the Stalker's interaction with players evolve based on the technology of the time? To understand how the Stalker is implemented in games today, we have to start with the medium's earliest generations to study the timeline of gaming's scariest enemy. This is a history of Stalker horror games. A famous detective once said that time is a flat circle. One needs no more evidence of this than the very first Stalker game, Sen Nostromo. In this NEC PC 6001 game, your space transport ship, the Nostromo, has been invaded by an alien. Yes, you heard that right, there's an alien on the Nostromo. Nostromo draws obvious influence from Ridley Scott's 1979 classic, Alien, and it's almost poetic that the genre of horror, now notorious for its portrayal of the Xenomorph, started with a game so heavily influenced by it. Though it may not look it to modern-minded eyes, Nostromo is fascinating. It's a microcosm of so many of today's conventions distilled in their purest form. In Nostromo, you have to avoid the alien so you can gather parts from lockers to repair and get off the ship. The alien patrols around until the second you leave the safe zone, where it springs into action. Conceptually similar to tether and director systems in today's games, the alien in Nostromo seems to always have some idea of where you are, and it never leaves your vicinity. That's why your only recourse is to trick it. The alien's patrol changes based on the tile you're standing on, so intentionally standing on a tile that makes it patrol on its furthest rotation gives you the best chance of getting back to the safe zone with all your items. Fortunately, this alien is no pushover. It's very fast, which requires you to make split-second decisions about where you're going. The door to open the lockers also needs 2 pushes to open, so you can't just instantly open the door and be safe. Despite Nostromo's obvious limitations given the now primitive nature of its design, it's a game that wholeheartedly embodies what we understand as a Stalker game. An unkillable, unrelenting enemy that chases you until you escape it or die. It's nearly impossible to describe the history of anything in gaming without mentioning the Atari 2600. In a time where survival horror as we know it didn't exist, Haunted House was one of the first games to feature not just stalkers, but also mechanics like item management. In Haunted House, you're trying to find 3 broken pieces of a magic urn, and you have to avoid all the creatures and ghosts trying to stop you. You can only see the pieces of the urn if you strike a match that illuminates your surroundings, and notably, the game has more items than just the urn. You can also pick up a magic scepter that makes you invisible to enemies, or a master key that unlocks all the doors. The catch is that you can only have either the urn, the scepter, or the key in your inventory at once, so you have to choose which object is most important to your current goal. The reason Haunted House is of interest to us in understanding the evolution of the Stalker lies in the game's multiple difficulty modes. In Game 1, the recommended mode for first-time playthroughs, enemies, if they see you, will try to attack, but they're still contained to the rooms and floors you see them on. The higher you bump up the difficulty, categorized by games 2 through 9, you start to notice different behaviors in the AI. By game 6, the enemies can follow you from room to room, turning them into bona fide stalkers. In the context of the time, this is amazing. Haunted House was one of, if not the first horror game where if you left a room, the enemies would just follow you into the next one. It may not look it, but when you're dodging enemies and trying to find those pieces of the urn with your tiny match, it's actually frantic and atmospheric. Haunted House was also among the first products that Atari ever openly marketed as a horror game, and one can see why, given that it laid the groundwork for enemies that could mimic the agency of a real threat. Have you ever played a game and instantly understood its impact on a genre? That's how I would describe Clock Tower, the grandfather of Stalker games. You can see that the games we've covered so far were limited in their capacity to portray certain elements of horror. That was tied directly to the strength of graphics processing units of the time. By the mid-90s, technology had progressed enough where developers could create genuine cinematic experiences, and that's how Clock Tower was born. Influenced by the films of Dario Argento and others, Clock Tower put players in the shoes of Jennifer Simpson, who along with her friends, all orphans, has been adopted and swept away to a mysterious mansion. It doesn't take long for things to go awry, and Jennifer soon finds one of her friends dead, murdered by the Scissor Man. Scissor Man is Clock Tower's infamous stalker, appearing randomly to torment and kill Jennifer if caught. Clock Tower's gameplay makes Scissor Man the very first obvious example of what we know as a stalker. He is Jennifer's only real obstacle as she finds keys and solves puzzles to progress further into the Barrows mansion. I have to admit, the first time I sat down with Clock Tower, I wasn't really expecting to be blown away. I believed that the scope required to make a fleshed out Stalker game was far beyond the limitations of the SNES. But I quickly realized that subverting this ignorant belief is what made Clock Tower so special and influential. We look at modern games and think that some things are only possible today, but like with everything in older games, selling the illusion that something is happening is more than good enough. You see, Scissor Man isn't stupid, or rather, the developers at Human Entertainment who made Clock Tower weren't stupid. They understood the psychology behind trying to escape a stalker, and knew that players, regardless of when they would play the game, would try to outsmart Scissor Man, and accounted for it. It's these surprises when he outsmarts you or comes out of nowhere that convince you that Scissor Man is far more advanced than he actually is. That's also thanks to the game's random events, some which trigger depending on the order you do things, and others which are truly random. On top of all this, Clock Tower also has one of horror's earliest implementations of a stamina and panic system. Jennifer's ability to fend off Scissor Man is determined by how much strength she has, and strength is used when running or panicking. The lower left-hand portrait of Jennifer shows her strength, and she can replenish it by stopping to take a rest. When Scissor Man confronts her, if she has high enough strength, you can mash the panic button to resist him. Scissor Man can't be killed in this manner, but you can certainly knock him off balance long enough to get away. Clock Tower is a landmark achievement in horror games. Where the prior Stalkers we've discussed were more abstract and conceptually amorphous, Clock Tower was able to consolidate the technology of its time to bring gaming the stalker and prey dynamic as we know it today. In 1996, horror games would change forever with the release of Resident Evil, but it wasn't until 1998 that the franchise would introduce what is considered by many to be one of its core mechanics, the Stalker enemy. Though Mr. X was confined to B scenario in 2, Resident Evil 3 would build an entire game around its stalker, Nemesis. What Clock Tower achieved in 2D, Resident Evil took to its logical next step by incorporating it into its high-quality 3D presentation. Mr. X came first, and as such is more limited than Nemesis, although the Resident Evil 2 team must have been aware of his limitations and programmed him to work against an interesting assumption the user player makes when playing Resident Evil. The classic Resident Evil games do not have much interaction with their environments. This is obviously because the environments are functionally just pictures, having been pre-rendered to be capable of running on the hardware of the era. Resident Evil 1's most notorious jump scare is obviously the dogs crashing through the window, but I'd say Mr. X breaking through the walls in the RPD is equally effective, shattering the player's expectation that they're safe so long as a room is empty and causing them to overestimate Mr. X's agency and intelligence. Mr. X doesn't actually pursue the player. He was scripted to only appear in a set number of locations, but his entrance and perseverance throughout the story settled him as a classic stalker. Nemesis, on the other hand, is an obvious upgrade. As I said, Resident Evil 3 is built around a stalker. Nemesis wants his stars, and although he is scripted to appear like Mr. X, the key differences are that Nemesis is fast as hell, and he can actually follow you. I had forgotten this while replaying the game, and was shocked when Nemesis appeared in the room when the camera angles changed. For 1998, just spawning him into a room when you can no longer see the door you came in through is very creative. Resident Evil 3 also introduced dodging to the series, which incentivized players to take the fight to Nemesis, rewarding them with weapon parts when he falls. Though he isn't truly killable until the end of the game, Nemesis never giving up made him even more unsettling. Because Resident Evil was the first mainstream franchise to feature the Stalker enemy, Mr. X and Nemesis were many gamers' first encounter with the concept and helped give developers a framework that they would build on in later years. By 2005, the Clock Tower franchise had all but died out. Following the underperformance of Clock Tower 3, Haunting Ground, also known as Demento, was made as a spiritual successor to the series. And what a successor it is, acting as an evolution and homage to the gameplay and atmosphere of the Clock Tower games. Once again, you play as a girl who finds herself in a desolate mansion, but this time, you're not alone. Fiona, joined by the goodest boy Huey, face 5 unique Stalker enemies. Like Clock Tower before it, Haunting Ground understood that a good Stalker game begins with a vulnerable protagonist. Fiona Belli, just a teenager, cannot possibly overpower any of the monsters who stalk after her. All of Haunting Ground's tension and challenge is born from the acceptance that you can't just gun down or smack down its cast of enemies. So what are the inner workings of a game with different stalkers, all who could easily subdue or kill Fiona? Well, Haunting Ground was one of the first 3D games to use patrolling stalkers, who exist in perpetuity until you run into them or they run into you. It's likely that Debilitas, Daniela, Ricardo, and Lorenzo are all programmed to have some idea of where Fiona is, but they do still roam around the map, meaning that you can encounter them outside of purely scripted sequences like Scissorman, Mr. X, or Nemesis. If you play the game correctly, it's possible to go long periods without seeing them at all. That's because Haunting Ground also helped pioneer sound technology in Stalker games. Fiona's footsteps, environmental interactions, and her commands to Huey all make sound that the stalkers can hear, and being too loud will give away your location. Clock Tower's influence can again be seen in Haunting Ground's own panic system, where Fiona will eventually become uncontrollable if she's too panicked by the presence of a stalker. Fiona and Huey also have stamina that needs to be monitored and restored. In a game where avoiding stalkers is so desirable, one may wonder how Fiona is meant to deal with them when confronted, and that's where a variety of additional mechanics come into play. Fiona can hide in certain locations, although stalkers will catch on if you use the same hiding spot repeatedly, and she can use alchemic ingredients to blind and shock the stalkers. Finally, there's Huey. I've not seen an entity like Huey in a Stalker game before or since Haunting Ground, and I believe it has something to do with the complexities of a roaming companion AI that requires training to obey the player. Huey will help Fiona get away from the Stalkers when you command him to attack, but only if their bond is strong enough. Otherwise, he'll oftentimes ignore her and be of no use. You need to scold Huey if he doesn't do what you say, but encourage him when he does. Huey will disobey you unless you train that behavior out of him, so spamming encouragement to boost your friendship level or endlessly feeding him treats just won't work. You're given plenty of chances to train Huey, as he has to fetch a number of key items necessary to progress the story, but any commands to Huey run the risk of tipping off the area's nearby Stalker, creating this brilliant cat and mouse game where you have to weigh the risks of making sound. Speaking of sound, the game also teaches you when enemies are near using music. If you hear ambiance, usually a soothing song, the Stalker is far. When the game's ambient soundtrack stops and you hear nothing, the Stalker is close and will come running if you make any loud noise. Finally, when the Stalker's music is playing, they're right on you. You'll know if you've lost a Stalker when you go back to hearing nothing, but that's not a guarantee they won't pop back up if you aren't careful. The Stalkers themselves are quite smart, to the point where the game's "coast is clear" message is sometimes misleading, since the Stalkers can come back to check a room they were previously in and find you again. It always feels like Fiona is one vase kick away from danger, making Haunting Ground a historic leap for the Stalker enemy. Gone were the days of entirely predetermined Stalker encounters, along with the limitations of 2D and early 3D. Haunting Ground aspired to be more in-depth, scarier, and challenging than the games that came before it, and that's why we're still talking about it 2 decades later. In the 2010s, something changed in horror games. Maybe because a dog-eat-dog market had become even more impenetrable with a recent indie boom, or because technology had finally reached the point of mythical photorealism, horror games of this era got darker, meaner, and a lot more personal. This shift was heralded by Outlast. In a time when Resident Evil had just released the gaming equivalent of a bad high school reunion, and corporate stupidity had killed off anything else remotely interesting in the genre, Outlast was unwavering in its crusade to define itself as a true horror game, and one with familiar adversaries presented in an unfamiliar perspective. In Outlast, you play as journalist Miles Upshur, investigating a tip on Mount Massive Asylum, a psychiatric hospital where human rights violations are as common as days ending in the letter Y. Miles has arrived just in time to qualify for a wonderful, all-expenses-paid trip to hell. The player must navigate the asylum to escape, all while evading Outlast's band of stalkers, a truly repulsive bunch of psychopaths that take joy in pain, both giving and receiving. You'll notice that Outlast is the first game we're discussing with a first-person perspective. Removing a camera dimension and severely limiting the player's view of their surroundings became a staple in stalker horror games of this era, and for good reason. Many argue first person is the more immersive perspective, and while I'm inclined to agree, regardless of one's feelings, Outlast would not be the same game if it weren't in first person, nor its stalkers as threatening as they are. Outlast relies on its camera mechanics for much of its horror, certain places being completely devoid of light and searchable only with your camera's night vision. Until this decade of horror, it was not common to plainly see stalkers inhabiting the same space as you. The first-person perspective, in tandem with its camera, gave it sense of dread and edge that previous horror games had not yet discovered. Like games before it, the stalkers of Outlast patrol spaces, acting as obstacles between you and your objectives. By the 2010s, sound was a prevalent part of horror games, incorporated to limit the player's speed and actions. Chris Walker, the twins, or Traeger will come running if they hear the player opening and closing doors too loudly, or interacting with triggers, but quickly lose interest if they can't find Miles. Outlast is most notable for the player's inability to attack the enemies. As the game tells you at the start, you are utterly defenseless, just a journalist who couldn't reasonably hold his own against the lunatics of Mount Massive, or even the smaller patients who have no regard for their own well-being. Outlast's legacy is ultimately how straightforward it is. It's a game that knows what it wants its players to feel and how to achieve it using its minions to create a tangibly oppressive atmosphere. The horror genre as a whole owes a great debt to the games of the early 2010s for experimenting with and fully realizing what could be achieved with first-person presentation. We've reached an apex. In the majority of horror games, the stalkers are human, and humans, however strong, are fallible. If they bleed, they can be killed. But what happens when the stalker isn't human? When their blood itself is a defense mechanism? When killing them is impossible, not because the game won't allow it, but because you're just lower on the food chain. We got our answer in 2014 with Creative Assembly's horror and stalker masterpiece, Alien Isolation. Set 15 years after the events of Alien, Isolation reintroduces us to Ellen Ripley's daughter, Amanda, who is still looking for her mother after she and the crew of the Nostromo disappeared. There are all sorts of compliments one could pay to Isolation, like highlighting all the details that went into bringing the world of Alien and the Sevastopol station to life, but I think it goes without saying that Isolation's brilliance, 11 years after the fact, lies in the technical machinations of the Xenomorph. Putting players into an already existing world, and one with an infamously predatory foe, Isolation couldn't settle for the Xenomorph's AI being just okay. Selling the acerbic, indifferent rage of the Xenomorph would not have been possible if the player could run circles around them at first glance. That's why Creative Assembly constructed what is still considered gaming's most advanced stalker, a concoction of behavior trees, proximity sensors, and vision cones. The Xenomorph was brought to life by crafting a hyper-awareness that prioritized the creature's agency. Contrary to the 1979 film, we don't need Ash to tell us that the Xenomorph is the perfect organism. You can see it on full display when you try the usual gamer antics against it. Isolation is equal parts terrifying and intriguing, the outcome of begging for games that challenge our preconceived notions of what the medium is capable of. It's difficult to not admire the artificial intelligence of this clever creature, even if it is the source of one's screaming fits. Rarely does anything in games feel sentient. Games have nowhere near the capacity to achieve that even today. But similar to Clock Tower, the illusion is good enough, and sold just as well in Isolation as it was in the original film, because the game understood that the recipe for success was to recapture the audience and Ellen Ripley's feelings of panic and anxiety. Amanda Ripley, unlike many of the protagonists we've spoken about, is not totally defenseless. Her engineering talents and the player's management of resources both required to deal with Isolation's hierarchy of threats aboard the Sevastopol. Below the Xenomorphs are the working Joes, androids with no hope to dream of electric sheep. They can be fought, but you have very little chance of winning unless you're willing to risk alerting a nearby Xenomorph with gunfire. At the very bottom are humans. It's better to run from all enemies if possible, but humans can also be shot, lit on fire, and most hilariously, baited into deadly confrontations with the Xenomorph. Alien Isolation never shies away from the survival horror identity at its core, but the game's additional systems and fervent devotion to its AI put it a step above many, even a decade later. It's not a stretch to say that Isolation likely influenced every single game you're going to see from this point forward, with its spirit invoked even in completely different genres. Isolation is nothing short of generational, and one can only hope that its sequel in development lives up to its legacy. Built on technology created for Resident Evil 7's return to form, the remakes of Resident Evil 2 and 3 were able to overhaul and modernize the series' original Stalkers. It was finally prime time for Mr. X, introducing himself to players who never experienced the game's original B scenario. Now present in both Leon and Claire's stories, the hulking menace was able to step out of the shadow of his Jill Valentine-obsessed cousin. While Nemesis was relegated to mostly scripted sequences due to the shortened and constrained nature of 3's remake, Mr. X was given full domain over a larger map and clearly picked up a few tricks since 1998. Mr. X now patrols the RPD, always looming and audibly searching for the player, and equipped with a fresh pair of ears, he was given the ability to investigate loud sounds the player makes. With his new sound interactivity, it's actually possible to stealth your way around him, if he doesn't see you. Leon and Claire make louder sounds when running, which he seems to always be able to hear, but he's never aware of your pinpoint location, only that he heard sounds in the area. Mr. X also interacts with the zombies, comically punching or shoving them aside in conquest of his ultimate goal. Now, Nemesis uses zombies a bit differently. Resident Evil 3 Remake is shorter than its original counterpart. As such, Nemesis doesn't really roam like Mr. X does, and his ability to follow you into other spaces is limited by the game's scripted transitions. But he too has new interactions with other enemies, and Jill, his repeated intrusions, cementing him as the game's primary antagonist from the second the game begins. Like in the original game, you have ways of dealing with him, and you're still incentivized to spend resources taking him down. The modernized dodging mechanics make some fights with Nemesis and the rest of the game's enemies quite funny, as Jill appears untouchable and unbothered by what's happening. Though Resident Evil 2 kicked off an industry-wide series of horror remakes, I believe Mr. X and Nemesis are the only Stalkers that have seen these updates. And that's a shame, because both games put more than a fresh coat of paint on their characters. I hope this overview was insightful and maybe introduced you to a game or two you hadn't seen before. Like their ominous and ever-present nature, the concept and mechanics of Stalkers have followed the horror genre since its inception. It's important to never forget the stepping stones a genre or a game used to get where it is today. From Nostromo all the way to modern games like Amnesia: The Bunker or the upcoming Resident Evil Requiem, gamers love the thrill of being chased by enemies they can't escape. Thanks for watching.